In this video, I'll help you understand shade. What is deep shade and part shade? And how does the difference affect the way you garden? We'll also have a look at some special shade conditions, like growing under maple trees and evergreen. And what about that walnut tree where nothing grows? Once you know how shade affects plants, it becomes so much easier to actually grow a shade garden. I'll have separate videos for specific plants that grow well in shade. Let's have a look at some shady conditions so that we can understand what shade really is. This is a picture of my own backyard, and you can see that the foreground is a very shady area, and you might conclude that this is a shade garden. But in fact, this is a full sun garden. It just happens that I took the picture at about 11 o'clock, and some very large maple trees just to the right of the picture are hiding the sun from this particular garden. This area gets full sun all morning long, and then after about 12:30 it gets sun all afternoon. So it's quite a sunny area. To better understand the type of shade conditions you have, it's a good idea to go out in your garden at several different times during the day and just look at where the shade is. In fact, you can take a piece of paper and actually mark it out so you have an idea how the shade changes throughout the day. We define full sun as being anything more than 6 hours of direct sun. Well, 6 hours actually isn't really full sun, is it? But 6 hours is enough to grow sun-loving plants. Anything less than 6 hours we consider to be a shade or part shade garden. Now you might have also heard the terms part shade and part sun. And what is the difference there? And some people try to go and define those and come up with specific hours. But to be honest, you can ignore those terms. A part shade garden is anything that gets some direct sun during the day. Plants are not that tricky to grow, and they're quite flexible. In fact, I find that most sun-loving plants will grow in part shade. Most shade-loving plants will grow in full sun, provided they get enough water. This is a picture of my house, and this wall faces directly north. But if you look at it, it looks as if this is a very sunny garden. Well, it gets sun first thing in the morning for a couple hours, and then it gets sun again late in the day for another 2 or 3 hours. So it's a part shade garden. There are two things that can cause shade in your garden. One is actual structures, like your house, or maybe a tall fence. The second thing that causes shade in your garden are trees. Now here's a picture of a lonely tree, and it does cause shade underneath the branches. But the amount of shade depends very much on how low the branches are on the tree. If you have a tree in your backyard and it's giving you too much shade, you can limb it up. What that means is that you cut off some of the lower branches so that sun can come in from the sides and hit the ground below the tree. And in fact, you can have a single tree in your garden and it's actually quite a sunny spot underneath. Now if you start adding more trees to that and you end up with a forest, then you have a much shadier area. And when trees are grown very close together, even limbing them up doesn't give you a sunny spot because there just isn't enough light coming in between the trees to get down to the trunk area. The other thing that's very important to notice about shade gardens is that they can be very wet or very dry. Now usually under trees it's a pretty dry environment, particularly if you're on flat ground. The tree roots suck up a lot of the water and take it away from other smaller plants that are trying to grow underneath it. But if the area is hilly and you're sitting in a valley, then rain can come down and fill that area and you can actually have quite a wet area. Wet areas are also created when the soil has a very high clay content. So it's a good idea to find out how much moisture you have. That will determine the kind of plants that will be happy there. Now let's look at some so-called problem areas in the garden. The first one is growing under walnut trees. The common belief is that nothing grows under a walnut tree. Walnut trees produce a chemical called Juglone, and this enters the soil, and that Juglone prevents plants from growing. Well, it turns out that that actually is a myth. First of all, walnut trees do not produce Juglone. Now they do produce another chemical, and when that chemical is exposed to air, it does turn into Juglone. So the soil underneath walnut trees does have some Juglone in it. But it turns out that that Juglone only prevents small seedling plants of some varieties of plants from growing. Most plants grow just fine under a walnut tree. Here's a list of just some of the plants that you can grow under a walnut tree. The real problem is that the soil is very dry and the tree is quite large, so it produces a fair amount of shade. So what you have here is a dry, shady area, and most plants just don't grow well in such an area. So you have a couple of options. One is you can limb up the tree and get more light in. That helps. You can also water more. So if you water more, the plants you're trying to grow will do better. Don't feel that a walnut tree will stop you from having a great garden. The second problem I'd like to look at is growing under evergreens. Now, the common belief is that evergreen needles are acidic, and as these needles drop to the ground, they acidify the soil, and plants just don't do well in acidic soil. Well, it turns out that that's a complete myth. First of all, evergreen needles are not very acidic, and that's when they're on the tree and green. As soon as they turn brown and fall to the ground, they're no longer acidic. What that means is that evergreens do not make the soil underneath them acidic. The problem under evergreens is that there is very little light and the needles don't fall off entirely in fall, like a deciduous tree. The second problem is that the roots of evergreens are very fibrous and very close to the surface of the soil. These roots suck up all the water, so other plants have difficulty growing there because they're not getting enough moisture and they're not getting enough nutrient. So growing under evergreens can be tricky. As far as the acidity in the soil goes, there's lots of plants that will grow in acidic soil. In fact, most plants prefer a slightly acidic soil. Another area that can be tricky to grow things is under maple trees. This is especially true of the Norway maple, which has become a very popular plant. This tree has extremely shallow roots, sucks up all the water. It also has very large leaves, so very little light gets through the tree itself, and so underneath we have a very dark area to grow. How do you solve this problem? Well, the best thing you can do is just cut it down. Norway maples aren't really the best tree to grow. Now, you've probably heard that if you're planting trees, you should plant trees that have deep tap roots, and that way you can have gardens underneath them. This is sort of true, but it's actually mostly a myth. So we think of some trees as being shallow rooted and other trees as being tap rooted, much more like a carrot. Now you can see this easily in seedlings. Some tree seedlings have very shallow roots, and others, like the oak for instance, have a very deep taproot. But what happens as that tree matures is that the oaks will also develop a shallow root system. And over time, the large taproot actually gets absorbed, and in some cases actually disappears. So if you're looking at older trees, all the trees have shallow roots. And this makes sense if you think about it. Most of the nutrients and the moisture is near the top of the soil. Tree roots also need a lot of air, and the best place to get air in the soil is in the top foot of soil, and that's where tree roots grow. So although you can pick trees that have a more open root system, they all have shallow root system, and they'll compete with the plants you put there. In my own garden, I've been gardening under 2 large sugar maples for quite some time, and although all the books say it's very hard to garden under sugar maples, I have no trouble growing plants there. So what are the secrets to planting a shade garden? The most important part is selecting the right plants. Some plants just do better under shade. If you have a wet area, you can buy plants that like a good, moist, shady soil. If your area is dry, and that will be the case for most people, then you need to look for plants that don't mind growing in dry shade. If you pick the right plants, you can have a very lush garden with lots of color, lots of form, and lots of flowers. For most people, the problem with a shade garden is that it's dry. The trees are just taking too much moisture away. So one solution to this is to water more. And my shade garden is really the only area in my garden that I water if we don't get enough rain. The other thing you should do with shade gardens is mulch them. Mulch with something like wood chips. And this does 2 things for your garden. First of all, it keeps moisture in the ground. That allows your plants to grow as well as the tree roots. The second thing that happens is that wood mulch decomposes over time and adds humus and organic material to the soil. When you have a new plant to add to your shade garden, don't dig up a large area. You're just going to damage too many of the tree roots. When adding a new plant to your shade garden, just dig a small hole. That way you'll do the least amount of damage to the tree roots. You can add a bit of soil to the surface over tree roots, and if you add an inch or two, it probably won't damage the tree. But if you add too much soil over top of tree roots, something like a foot for example, you can actually kill the tree roots. That will kill the trees. So you really can't change the level of the soil in an existing shady garden. Unless, of course, the shade is caused by man-made structures like fences and houses. Now that you know all about shade gardens, it's time to pick the plants. I'll be producing additional videos to help you select different types of plants. If you have any questions, please leave a comment below and I'll answer it personally. Even better, join our Facebook group called Garden Fundamentals. People from all over the world will answer your questions there about any topic to do with gardening. Thank you for supporting this channel.